So we want places to exist, whether it's just being on the land or taking care, removing invasive species, or being able to pick berries, being able to be there and have our own personal ceremonies if we need, being able to be there and have a house that we can invite people to gather, all of that is what you could describe as healing. I would say it's even more powerful to describe it as existing, because there's nothing wrong with us. We just don't have anywhere to go and do these things.
This is the Good Fire Podcast, stories of Indigenous fire stewardship, cultural and social empowerment, and environmental integrity. Tansei kia all. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Good Fire. And that is how we say, hello, how are you in Cree? I'm trying to learn my language, like many people are who are Indigenous. And for me, it's been interesting because a generation ago, my family were fluent Cree speakers. And within one generation, that was completely lost. And so it just shows how quickly language or knowledge can be removed from people through colonization and force. And so today we have Tiffany Joseph on the podcast. And so Tiffany and I met through the Indigenous Fire Circle with Parks Canada. I have always been so impressed with Tiffany and the work that they do. Just an amazing storyteller. They work with pollinators and plants and other things and really uplifting Indigenous women into safe spaces. And so really excited that we could feature Tiffany on this episode. And yeah, I'll see you after. Okay, so welcome back to another episode of Good Fire. I'm Amy, and I'm here today with Tiffany Joseph. And so Tiffany and I actually met with the Indigenous Fire Circle with Parks Canada. And the second I met Tiffany, they just have such an important story to share. And especially with the work that they're doing, which we're going to get into, I've been so inspired by, rematriating and other things that they're involved in. So yeah, Tiffany, if you want to introduce yourself, and yeah, if you could just chat a little bit too about the use of fire in your territory. I know that there's a really important relationship there between Camas and the Oaks.
Thank you, Amy. ACM, Shalaswit and a snet. Elsentiu Setnet G Tinachin class Hopmish Okumilch, Tanitsen Kautsen, Tanitsen Samana. Aschichuatai iet Nikalos iet Aesnatat Tanangana, Kalkothamat and attain Kiam Tanamain, Sweeholatapla, iet Thiwanamatla, iet Schananol, Tiets Quatsimotuch Tanasal Silala. My name's Tiffany Joseph. I'm Husaitnich Kolmish in Kautsen, and I'm here in my Husaitnich homelands. I introduced my children and my parents and grandparents. It's our protocol in Coast Salish nations, of which all the nations I've named are Coast Salish, to introduce our family when we introduce ourselves so that people can locate you and they can identify your family. And if I say, my grandmother is Yvonne, Lady Yvonne Joseph, people say, oh, I know who you are. We'll never have met, but because they know my grandma, they know who I am because of my family. And it hasn't been part of the protocol to introduce children, but the reason I introduce my parents and grandparents is because they're the reason I'm here in this world. They brought me into the world, but my children are the reason I stay, and they're the reason I'm committed to the work that I do. The Sinchotha name that I carry, Shkalasowit, it's a Nenapmain, which means like a nickname. And Shkalasowit comes from Sinchothan word Shkalasung, which means camera. And Alwit is a feminizing suffix in Sinchothan, but also in other neighboring Coast Salish languages. So people would hear that name and know it's a feminine name. And my name literally translates as camera lady. I went to school for Indigenous independent digital filmmaking at Capilano College, back when it was still Capilano College. It's now Capilano University. I received my certificate, but I was pregnant with my son. So after I completed the certificate, I became a stay-at-home mom. But I'll get more into the camera lady part of things perhaps later. But the work that I'm really focused on is related to taking care of the land. I started doing restoration work back in 2015. I first started learning about Indigenous plants and restoration work in the end of 2014. I did a program called Growing Our Futures, which was a program in partnership with Sayout First Nation and Royal Roads University, and got to learn a lot about native plants in terms of being able to restore land and care for land. So not in the medicinal plant kind of way, But of course, we all knew, those of us attending the program knew these are all our Indigenous medicines. And so those of us who were in that program, we reflect very fondly about being able to learn about the plants. And there's so many of us who we've reconnected here and there over the years, and they'll just get so excited talking about plants. And anyone who's like a plant nerd knows that like a 15-minute walk can take 3 hours when you're into Indigenous plants. So a lot of us still have that immense interest in the native plants. And I started learning about camas, which is kwla'l. Kwla'l is the Centrothan word for camas, which was our food staple. Camas was our food staple, like how potatoes and rice might be a food staple to people today. But if you were to look at the landscape from, say, Stianoch, which is Beecher Bay First Nation, Stianoch, all the way up to Husikum, which is all the southern Vancouver Island, there would have been huge camas meadows throughout that whole landscape, throughout that whole territory. And they said you could walk from UVic to Fort Victoria back when Fort Victoria existed, and you were walking through a camas meadow the entire way. And a friend of mine, James Miskelly, he's a settler who operates a native plant nursery called Satin Flower Nurseries with his spouse, Kristen Miskelly. When he does talks, he shares about how in a journal, I guess the guy was a botanist, came to our territory, and he walked to the top of a hill and he looked out over our land, and he described it as being so blue he thought he was looking out on the sea, but he was actually looking at a field full of camas.
Wow.
And that's how abundant the Husaitnich and Lekwungen people are our neighbors, that we've always had to work together to take care of these lands. That's how abundant we were able to propagate the camas. And because our land was tended in a way to make these very vast meadows, when the colonizers came, it was reminiscent of like farmlands and how they could operate, that they were like, oh, this is perfect land to steal for our
it's
farms.
Already cleared, thanks.
Yeah. And of course, colonizers, they were operating under the terra nullius mindset, which is that land is not occupied unless it's occupied by a Christian. And so they considered the land empty, even though there was thousands of Indigenous people here staring them in the face. They considered the land wild, even though all of those meadows were tended to with controlled burns. So the clotl has a companion plant, which is like a mighty oak. And if you look at old pictures of how tall the oaks were compared to a human being, like the humans look tiny. It's kind of like when you look in a textbook or even a children's book and it shows you like the scale of a human being standing next to like a dinosaur and how a human being looks tiny. Like that's how big the oaks were. And unfortunately, there's no oak that big that I know of really anymore. And the branches were really high up. So those controlled burns were burning the trees, but they weren't killing them. And in fact, they were making any of those oaks that did not burn, they were getting stronger. And so that means, through the natural process of a controlled burn, those lower branches would have been burned off, right? And so those trees got so tall, but those leaves that fall from the oaks, that is a big contributor to fertilizer for the camas. However, it has to be burned because those leaves are, I believe, and don't quote me on it, because when it comes to these different like chemicals within leaves and soil, I always get confused about them. But the leaves, I believe, are just too acidic.
Oh, okay.
And so our ancestors learned that by burning the leaves, you transform that high acidity into the proper nutrients needed for the camas. And so those controlled burns, we burn the leaves and the grass and some of the small shrubs, and they return nutrients to the soil because our land is clay. We don't have that like 10 feet of loam that like the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have to grow their corn, beans, and squash, we have clay. And however, the soil being clay, colonizers tend to say like, oh, you can't grow anything in this. I'm like, that's funny because we grew enough camas to make it look like land was so blue it looked like water. And also we were able to grow the greatest amount of biodiversity in any ecosystem in so-called BC. And that still stands to this day, that we have the most plant biodiversity within our ecosystem. So fire was a necessity to that. But also, I would say even before fire is ait squalquins in Centrothan, or hot squalwin in Squamish, or ait squalwin in Hulkaminum. And that means good thoughts and feelings, because anytime you're on the land, you have to have good thoughts and feelings. And so anytime you light a fire, you have to be in that prayerful mindset. And being in a prayerful mindset really means having that abundance of positivity within your heart and your mind. And I say heart and mind also because squalaquins, or squallowin, it means that your thoughts and emotions, or your mind and your heart, are connected. There's no separation from those two parts of your body, but also like those ways of thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling is one and the same. So being in that prayerful mindset means you have abundance in your heart and your mind. You're not being on the land from a place of lack. You're being in a place of honoring all life, that you're not there just for yourself. We really emphasize like we're a part of a whole. In Squamish, we call that in Chotmo. In Sinchothan, it's Natsamat. And in Hulkaminum, it's Nutsamat. We're all one. And for most of my life, people use that to try and educate our own people, but even settlers, that we're all one people. We're not separated. We're all connected. But I think when you're connected to the land, it's like, I'm connected to the camas that we're burning for. I'm connected to the pollinators that pollinate the camas. I'm connected to the beings in the soil and the birds that fly. And so we created this abundance of life with those teachings that come from Coast Salish people. And I feel like, it's important for me to say in saying that, yes, the Satanage people are distinct people with a distinct language. The Lekwungen people are distinct people with a distinct language. And each of those nations of people have laws and teachings that are specific to them. But at the end of the day, Coast Salish people, we share lots of teachings and beliefs and laws. And that's why we were able to be in good relationship with one another. And so when I say Coast Salish, I'm not just lumping us all together, that we do have governance protocols that we have to follow as Coast Salish people in relationship to one another. But it's really also hard for me to separate like anything I was taught, because there's generations of intermarriage between Satanish, Koltmish, and Kotsin peoples.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of like the Cree principle Wokotowin, which is like, it's basically of kinship, the law of kinship, and that everything's related. And yeah, and even amongst Cree people, like you said, there's very distinct nations, even amongst Cree people. But at the same time, we're all living together on the land, right? Like there's kind of one earth. And like where you are too, like you're all kind of on Vancouver Island together and all trying to look after the health of that land.
Mm-hmm. Do you know the meaning of Kiam in Cree by chance?
I
feel like it means like peace or something.
Oh, okay. Is it Kiyam? Kiam?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
That's my dad's ancestral name.
Oh, wow.
I have a friend who's Métis Cree, and she told me that word. So
yep.
I like to ask people if they've heard of it before, because it's my dad's ancestral name.
Yeah, I think I've seen it on sweatshirts at powwows too. Yeah. I was going to ask you too about like that relationship between the oak and the camas and fire. Like, I know when we think lots of times of like coastal environments or, Vancouver Island, places like that, people don't automatically think of fire, right? They think that, because it's often more wetter there, you get more rain, that, fire isn't needed or fire doesn't happen in those landscapes. But as I've been learning from you, Tiffany, I've really learned about the importance, even in, coastal nations like that, of fire. And I was wondering too, if, because things basically don't decompose there as fast. So I'm wondering as well if maybe that's some of how fire is helpful with the leaves as well, because it really like kind of speeds up the transition from, a leaf to being like a fertilizer for the plant.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the decomposition, because knowing this ecosystem for biologists especially is really important. I won't say the entity that I worked with, but I worked with this entity, and this woman came from, I think, like northern Alberta, but definitely Alberta. And she was like, oh, we have to restore this creek. Let's just put these rotting logs alongside the creek, because in her experience with rotting logs, you could just put them on the land. They decompose. By like the next year, you'll have a stand of trees. And I was like, that sounds like magic.
Yeah.
Because they put those logs by the creek, and years later, they're still there. Like, they've come and they've gone. They're not even working there anymore. And all these logs are just sitting alongside the creek.
Yeah. The logs beat them.
Yeah. And it was kind of funny to me, because the settler that kind of helped, that has worked in this ecosystem for a long time, who he was even helping with that, he was just like, oh, it's okay, it's going to break down eventually. I was like, in like 20 years or something, because it's already been like 10. Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous, honestly, just like logic. Because like sometimes I find that, like, yeah, somebody could work in my territory for decades, but they won't apply logic because they have some sort of other agenda, I guess.
I find some of it too is like a bit of like the centralization of knowledge, right? Where you think like, because like you said, one thing works somewhere, it's going to work somewhere else. We've almost lost like that local approach and context to knowledge where, you know, there's local people that are experts and also hold good knowledge about what might, you know, how fast a log might decompose. And maybe you don't need an expert from outside to, you know, tell you that.
Yeah.
So I was going to switch a little bit. So I was going to ask you about your work basically on trying to revitalize cultural fire there. And I know that you've worked a little bit with like Parks Canada and the team there at Gulf Islands National Park and other places in your territory on trying to bring back fire, that you've worked with kind of private landowners on reestablishing fire. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit on like what that experience has been like.
Mm-hmm. There's been, I guess you could say, positives and negatives. You know, it's good that the people at Parks Canada recognize that we have this traditional knowledge with fire and they see it as valid. That's like a really bare minimum that we can expect, but at least they do. I know there's a lot of people who don't have that experience in their territory. I think one of the challenges that comes with that is that settlers, they're hungry for culture, basically. And really, they need to find their own roots. You know, they have to like trace their English or Celtic origins, whatever it is, and connect with that. So I found that eagerness to work with fire with us kind of came from like a hungry place of not having their own cultures. And therefore, when there was valid concerns expressed by people in our community, they weren't really listening to them, you know? And another, I guess you could say, positive is just the opportunity to have some fire training certification for myself and a couple other stewards. And I think it's also important for me to note that a lot of the people who have been dedicated to doing restoration work within our territory, there's 3 women that I can think of, and then also a non-binary relative, you know, so it's a matriarchal responsibility that I see people stepping into. And so we're the ones who got like the certified fire training, and we didn't end up doing a fire. And I think it was the right call. And it's mostly because we don't have enough people in our community trained with fire, whether it's cultural or with some sort of government or organizational training that exists right now. So it wouldn't have been the best choice. However, basically some concerns that came up within our community is that the area we wanted to burn had burial cairns, and they didn't want the burial cairns to have an underground fire, which is valid. But the way it was kind of approached in terms of the words from some of the community members was like, it kind of seemed like they had the belief or the feeling that we should never burn near our ancestors. But the thing about Camas is that it is always near burial cairns. So that means we would have always been burning near our ancestors' burial cairns. So it's not inherently dangerous. I think it's still the fear of fire that came from decades ago of the BC wildfire messaging of Smokey the Bear. And I'm sure people have had like negative experiences with fire in their lifetime, but I think it's just a waking up that needs to happen for a lot of people, not just like my community, but just a lot of people around fire and being able to have a relationship with it, because we say that water is life, but I say that fire is also life, but it's got a death association, unfortunately, to a lot of people. And it's because it's been misused, it's been abused, and it is used in a violent way in history. So, and it feels like something people can't control. But when I've talked to some of my teachers, there's a spiritual relationship with fire, a spiritual connection we can have with fire, that things don't have to be wild or scary, and it's actually a beautiful part of creation.
Yeah, Tiffany, can you describe a little bit about what a burial cairn is and why they're, concerned with like the cultural fire, the slow burning, how it could impact those?
Mm-hmm. So burial cairns are what would be, I guess, the equivalent of a grave. Burial cairns are sacred sites where our ancestors have been laid to rest. And so we don't want to disturb burial sites. And we used to actually have ancestors, not buried, but like their resting place was like in trees and things like that. So burial cairns is kind of where it's one way that we would put our ancestors to rest. And so the main concern is just not wanting to disturb those sites.
Yep. Okay, I know, Tiffany, with the Indigenous Forest Circle as well, you shared a story about a burn that was done on some private lands that you were an advisor on, and you talked a lot about the seed bank and other things and, reinvigorating that. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share that story here.
Yeah. So I've learned a lot through restoration. I learned that there's an invasive plant called Scotch broom. And it has these yellow flowers, but it's got these big seed pods that just drop. And there's so many seed pods growing on a Scotch broom shrub that, like, basically what they advise when doing restoration around Scotch broom is that you make the smallest hole you possibly can, and or if you can, even better in their mind, is just pull the Scotch broom straight out. That way you won't disturb the seed bank. And when they were telling me that, I was like, I guess that's like a Band-Aid solution that you could try to implement, like, for the short term until perhaps you get some funding that you would need. Because, like, I'm like, what you're telling me is these seeds will stay in the ground. And once you disturb the soil, they will propagate and they will grow Scotch broom. So you can do all of this Scotch broom removal. You can have it eradicated for 10 years. But if someone comes along and disturbs that soil, then it's going to reproduce. So this private landowner, and when I say private, they own land that used to be one of our really important village sites. They had a huge crop of Scotch broom on the land. And I said, Parks Canada probably wouldn't want you to do this, or any other restoration group would think this is crazy. But I think you get a controlled burn to burn that Scotch broom, and then you bring in some heavy machinery that can dig out the seed bank. And that's the only way you'll really get rid of it. And these Parks Canada guys that I worked with, they got asked to do this controlled burn. They're all happy and excited. Oh, we get to do a controlled burn. And then they're like, but then they brought in these big machines to like dig up the soil. And we were like shocked. They were kind of horrified. And they're like, but then it turned out there must have been native plants underneath it, and the machines must have like turned the soil and stuff, because all these native plants came up. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a shock. It's like I gave them some direction based on some pretty sound logic, and it worked. I find that the settler mindset is in terms of restoration and conservation is very fear-based and really treats people like they're bad and can only do harm to the land. And I can see why settlers, colonizers, even when they have the land's interest at heart, could only see that within people. But I'm Indigenous, and my people have always cared for all life. It's been a law that we uphold, that we adhere to, and it's because that's, in a way, I think it's also important to like recognize like that's easy, you know? Unfortunately, the colonial mindset, they create this idea that like all humans are inherently selfish. And I'm like, oh, that's not, it's not how I was raised. And also like, what are you saying about yourself? You're inherently selfish. And do you really believe that's true about yourself? You know, because like, what do you do that is out of just the goodness of your heart? I imagine there's a lot, but also like, when you look at other people, do you see their generosity and their care for life? And why are you looking at basically not just like the worst of humanity, but like people act that way when they've experienced immense amounts of trauma and abuse and dehumanization, especially from their own parents. It's a huge projection of colonial history being put onto the land and other people, basically including Indigenous people who never had that way of life until colonial violence came to them. So that fear that the colonizers have, that projection, that's what I think is the thing that I push back against, not just within the colonizers, but within my own people. And at the same time, I recognize their fear is like, well, look at what they did to us. Look at what they did to our land. Of course, we have this fear. And I'm like, me personally, I don't want to live in that fear. I want to live in healthy relationship with the land, with my people, recognize that we all have lived through trauma. The land itself, of course, also has lived through trauma. But like, it is that colonial mindset that is like, once you're traumatized, you're damaged. And there's no point in trying to fix it, you know? But that's not an Indigenous mindset, because we have so many tools, so many ways of being that are like, here's one way you can heal from this kind of experience. Here's another way you can really, it's like reclaim yourself, reclaim a part of you that got lost and scared, and you can reclaim that and call it back to you. And so that's the mindset that I try to take in working with the land and have been developing in the past almost 10 years.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm really find too from agencies, and especially in fire agencies, is that they almost get so scared of doing the wrong thing. Like you said, that fear base, that then they just do nothing. And I call it like a paralysis, you know, where instead of like even trying the simplest thing, they just don't do anything because it's the easiest thing to do. But when I look like, you know, today we're sitting in Rocky Mountain House in tons of smoke. Jasper just got evacuated. You know, there's tons of evacuations in the north. The interior of BC has a lot of fire too. And so for me, like, you know, we can't just have paralysis anymore. We have to try and do different things because, you know, what's happening now isn't, you know, like you said, the land is just so unhealthy and people are unhealthy because of that. So switching to like a more positive subject is, you know, the current work that you're doing and the Rematriate Stewardship Project that you've got. I've loved if you could explain that to us, what it's about, what you're working on.
Yeah, I might use the word healing when I start talking about this, but I have to acknowledge that one of my own matriarchs says, don't say it's healing. So I'll be trying to avoid that. But, and so it might sound a little bit strange, but I do recognize that there's like healing that needs to take place. But the reason my auntie tells me not to just use that word to describe it is because then you're just going to kind of always be healing. You'll always find something to heal, find something that's wrong. And it's like,
yeah.
So with repatriate stewardship, the way I try to emphasize it is like, we're fundraising to buy land back so that we can have places just to exist. The Satanich, Lakwangin, Tuk, and Stianoch peoples, the women and the families there, we have these tiny reserves in this land, and we maybe make up 1% to 2% of the whole entire population of our own territories. And so when I say exist, it's like that whole landscape, those territories is ours. We're meant to be able to walk freely from Stianoch out to Sycam, to be able to travel freely across to the southern Gulf Islands and to the mainland through the Salish Sea. We're meant to live freely throughout all of those territories. And yet we're confined to these tiny little reserves. And so when we want to acquire land that's off reserve, it's like, this is a place where all of us get to exist. And whether that means just literally being like having a place to be in a safe place, that might be enough for somebody. For another person, they might be like, wow, this whole 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 acre property is meant for us. I want to be a part of removing the grass here so that we can plant native plants here. Somebody might feel like that's more than they can do, really. Their physical labor is not really where they're drawn in that way. But once we plant the native plants, especially berry plants, because like Indigenous people will come visit our territory and they'll kind of whisper to me, they're like, so where's the secret berry picking spot? And I'm like, well, we don't really have those around here because most of our land is privately owned. You know, if you were to find a so-called secret berry picking spot, it's probably in a park, so it's not that secret. You might be able to find something on somebody's property, but good chances that they would cut it down because they consider native plants a weed. So we want to be able to grow the native berry shrubs because that's a part of our culture that is just like missing for a lot of us. And even if we do berry pick, we berry pick invasive Himalayan blackberries. We don't get to pick the native trailing blackberries. The indigenous blackberry is called squalengo. We also have indigenous strawberries. We have like a coastal strawberry that grows in the drier habitat of like a beach. And we have woodland strawberry that grows more on the land. And we have thimbleberry. We have salmonberry. We have huckleberries. We also have Oregon grape, which is really, really tart. Like you bite it and you'll like make a sour face. And I actually recorded a video of my son when he was like, he was probably like 4. And he's like, can I try that? And I said, oh, sure, go ahead. And then I started recording and he took a bite and he like made a sour face and it made him drool immediately. So it's really tart. And I remember when I was younger thinking like, how would you even eat that? Because I would eat it. That's the thing about all these berries is that I did grow up picking them, but it was like few and far between. And once I have eaten them again as an adult, I'm like, oh, I ate that before. I remember this taste. So when I was a kid, I was going around trying out these different berries. And even then people would be like, don't just eat anything. But for our territory, most of what is in our land is not poisonous. You know, we don't actually have very much to fear in terms of like native plants, if they're poisonous or not. The only thing that you shouldn't eat and you wouldn't want to eat is snowberry. It doesn't look appetizing. It is a medicine, but in terms of a food, you wouldn't look at that and think, I want to try that totally white berry. So we want places to exist, whether it's just being on the land or taking care, removing invasive species, or being able to pick berries, being able to be there and have our own personal ceremonies if we need, being able to be there and have a house that we can invite people to gather, all of that is what you could describe as healing. I would say it's even more powerful to describe it as existing, because there's nothing wrong with us. We just don't have anywhere to go and do these things. Mm-hmm. We have everything we need. We just need to have a place to go and do it. And so we also would like to use this gathering space to be a place that anyone within our nations can come and learn our languages. The colonizers have divided us into these Indian bands. Mm-hmm. And I kind of find it's more confusing or less helpful that the Indian bands became to be called First Nations. Mm-hmm. Because now people think these are all different nations. As we're all one nation, we're all one people. We have different dialects, we have different family teachings, but we're all one people. And our way of life, our cultural way of life, is indicative of that. We are not separate. We're always working together. We're always going into these different territories and relying on one another. And we can't be separated. So it's the colonial mindset that has separated us. And so it's also an intention for us to just be able to gather as one people and not having to be divided by these reservations. Mm-hmm. And recognize we just have being in relationship with one another. That's another part of our way of existing, just existing. It would be healing also, but it's like we didn't physically separate ourselves from one another. Mm-hmm. It was the colonizer that physically separated us from one another. Mm-hmm. And they did that in residential schools too. They divided siblings and they wouldn't let siblings talk to one another. And there's a trauma there, right? They even made it criminal for two Indians to come together and talk. And that was in the lifetime of my great-grandfather, because they didn't want us to be able to exist. Mm-hmm. They didn't want us to exist. And so I guess it's that saying existence is resistance. Yeah. And so it's also recognizing that we as Indigenous people are a keystone species. Because if you look at the southern Vancouver Island on a map, but especially the prime example I use is Central Saanich, where the Sayout First Nation and Tsartlip First Nation, they actually are within Central Saanich. And on the west, you have Huichotlit, which is Tsartlip. On the east, you have Sayout. And they're really green. Unfortunately, Sayout isn't very green anymore because they have made some more developments. But just a couple of years ago, they were really green. And then you look in between at all this farmland that was stolen from our people, of course, it's all yellow. Mm. And so there's like a statistic that says 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people. That means we ourselves are a keystone species within an ecosystem. Mm. And so if there's these settler folks who want to protect our Garry Oak ecosystem, who want to protect our coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone ecosystem, we as the Indigenous people have to be protected as well. And so that's how we operate within our care of the land, because we're just as important as our land. This land will, if we are gone, this land will never be protected again. So it recognizes our inherent value cannot be separated from the land, And so allowing our people to get to understand that relationship, give space where we can have it. It's not even just space, it's more space, because yes, we've been confined to these tiny reserves, but we've been able to maintain our culture, been able to maintain our language, been able to even maintain some medicinal plant knowledge and food knowledge. And so it's just more space where it's like, all this other information that I once knew, or all this other information that I didn't know I needed to know, but because I have access to this land, now I know this information and can share it. And there's just more opportunity for us to expand in our existence as the Utat Huilngoch, the original Indigenous people to these lands.
Yeah, that's such amazing work that you're doing there. And I know in the past we've talked, and you've talked a lot about the idea of, although your auntie now might get mad, but, heal the caretaker, heal the land, which I really think is a beautiful vision. And you also mentioned to me before that, the love of the land is so tied with queer identity. So I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit too. I know that that's another area you're very passionate about.
Yeah, when I was younger, and it's still true to this day, I've never wanted to objectify people, like I was raised to understand that I'm sacred and all life is sacred. So to look at another human being and assess their value based on my sexual attraction to them felt too objectifying. And, the same goes with the land, like being able to look at so-called property and recognize, this is how I can make money and this is how I can make a profit. It's not in a sacred relationship with the land. And so at the same time, of course, I do feel like I can love people of any gender, but love, I think, is beyond a need for a romantic love. And the amount of love that I feel within me, as I guess you could say, as a two-spirit person, there's just so much love within me that it goes beyond human beings, and especially though for my love for women, like I really love women, and it's not about just wanting them or even wanting to provide for them. I love them so much that I want them to exist. I'm like, you're so powerful and beautiful, and like you deserve to just like exist without somebody wanting something from you, because as women, we are life givers. So when I say, even when I'm talking about women, I'm talking about myself too. We are life givers, and people do want things from us. They do want to have some sort of transactional relationship with us because of our abundance. Like I find myself having to navigate people not wanting to do their own work, and they want me to do their work for them. And predominantly that's in the emotional realm, the emotional labor. And I'll do a lot of emotional labor for people. It's like, it's easy to me, but at the same time, it's like, sometimes they they're so don't want to do their own work that they want to evoke your anger or your rage. They're like, I don't want to wake up. I don't want to acknowledge what I'm really feeling. I don't want to acknowledge that I have personal accountability here. Like, can you just pity me? And you can't pity them anymore. You have to unleash some rage because they need to wake up and be like, hey, you have personal accountability here in this situation. You actually have the power to do something here, and you're refusing to do it. You want somebody else to do it for you. And again, that love for women that I have, I'm like, I don't want a woman to feel like that about me. So I want to step up. I want to step up for other women, but I also want to step up for myself. And I also want to be able to have relationships where they're reciprocal. you know? So in that, there's a lot of personal accountability that I feel I need to hold myself accountable for. And part of it is recognizing that I grew up with a lot of safety. You know, my parents did not speak words that were shaming to me. You know, they didn't slut shame me. They didn't say anything like I was lazy or stupid or something like that. They didn't put pressure on me that I had to do anything that I didn't want to do. There was like, in a way, like, I guess, a lack of discipline. But when it came down to their choice of like, do I push this small human to live up to some sort of expectations, or do I just let them exist? My parents chose to let me exist. And I think there's a lot of medicine that I received from my parents by them treating me that way. There's a lot of love and acceptance where other people didn't get to experience love and acceptance. And so I feel it's important for me to share that with others, to show people, because they didn't get to grow up that way. They did have parents who slut shamed them or body shamed them or told them they were lazy or not smart. And I'm not even saying that I'm the person who can verbally or in action do that, but I believe I can create a safe space for that to exist. Create that normal where we treat each other with reverence, treat each other with sacredness, and meet everyone where they're at. And that's why it's like, if you just need to be here and breathe, then that's how you can show up as your best self. Then come here, breathe, sit, relax. And then if you just want to go after that, you can go. If to be your best self, you're like, I would love to pick berries here, then great. We will grow as many berries as possible for you to come and pick berries. And if all you do is eat what you pick, that's wonderful. If you pick so many berries, you get to make a blueberry pie or something like that, then that's also cool. Or if you make smoothies or juices or whatever, you don't have any expectation except to exist here. Because that's the way I was treated with love by my parents and my family. And even when I came out as bisexual in my late 20s, my parents were excited. You know, my mom was excited and my dad said, thank you. You know, not a lot of people have that experience themselves. And I even had an aunt be like, did you think I wouldn't accept you? Like, she was almost kind of angry about it. I was like, I was just still questioning, Auntie. It had nothing to do with whether or not you'd accept me. So there's even some fiercely like, I would accept you, and I am going to convince you as aggressively as possible that I would accept you for your love for people of the same sex or multiple genders.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Tiffany. I love that great advice of, let them just exist. I think especially for parents, that are facing so many pressures and like how to raise kids, and even for Indigenous women, right? It's like, I think we expect ourselves, not only to just hold one role in community, but to be an expert at everything, like being able to make a ribbon skirt, being able to be a berry picker, being able to bead, being able to, share knowledge about cultural fire and do all these things, when really like it's just okay to just exist.
Yeah. And like, that's a big part of it, right? Like, cause I do feel that pressure. I'm like, I can't make things with my hands very well. And like, I don't even make medicines because people think I make medicines. I'm like, nope, I just remove invasive plants and plant native plants. And I'm happy if that's just the role that I do, because a big part of that, like, yeah, it's because I do that for the land, but also like the land itself and all the inhabitants of the land, the birds and the bugs and the whole ecosystem. But like, I'm really excited to do it for women too, because I'm like, what are you going to make? What are
Mhm.
you going to do? Because you are a life giver. And when you have, that's the thing, is that every one of us has a role. We don't have to be all those things. And I think a lot of us also like are struggling because we have all these expectations. And it's like, well, no, don't put all this pressure on me. Like, we need to support more of our people taking up their role. And so that's a bit of the logic behind repatriate stewardship as well, is that like, no, I'm not going to fill every role just because you put this pressure on me. There's lots of us here who can share the work, and we just need to support them in finding their way.
Yeah, that's awesome. For me, that kind of relates a little bit to the fire situation. I don't know why. I guess I fire in the brain to always bring it back to that. But, when I see these unprecedented events, like what we're seeing now, probably what we're going to see in years coming with climate change. And it just gets overwhelming, right? Like, how do we stop fires? How do we make this? But I often think if we just roll it back to like our local context and doing what you can in your space, it makes the problem much more easier to bear.
Mm-hmm. It takes many hands to do great
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Like no one alone is going to solve the wildfire issue in Canada or even one agency, right? It's going to be multiple people and solutions. I'm wondering too, Tiffany. So just to wrap, I wanted to bring up too that you are a certified pollinator steward. And so I'm wondering if you can chat a little about that and how it relates to the camas in your area and burning that you want to do.
Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned before, I'll describe the ecosystems a little bit more. So, the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone, it's shortened to CDF. And actually, some people are changing it from coastal Douglas fir to coastal dry forest because we're this pocket on the west coast that's drier than the rest of the coast. And so when we've talked about controlled burns, they've taken place here on southern Vancouver Island, but they took place in all the Gulf Islands. They also took place places down south to like Skokomish, which is around Olympia, Washington. Skokomish. That's actually the first place I've had camas. But we tended, as Coast Salish peoples, this is transboundary, right? Because we didn't divide ourselves. We didn't divide Coast Salish people as Americans and Canadians. We were always interconnected peoples. And so that border really divided us, and to the point where we might be in so-called Canadian waters and we can look across and see our relatives of Lummi, which is where they had Sanchothan speaking people there as well. We can see them when they go out fishing, because they're the same waters. But the coastal dry forest is the ecosystem that has the most plant biodiversity, has the most plant species that we tended to with controlled burns. The Garry Oak ecosystem is specifically the meadow ecosystem within the coastal dry forest biogeoclimatic zone. And when I started learning about pollinators, it was through Pollinator Partnership, and their website is like pollinator.org. And I think they started out in the United States, and then Dr. Laura Morandin came, and she lives here in Victoria, and she connected with she's connected with like satinflower nurseries, and they created this pollinator steward certification for land managers, and I was invited to participate. And so when Dr. Laura Morandin was talking about bees, she immediately, one of the first things you learn is that there's solitary bees and there's social bees. And she told us that like the social bee are what honeybees are. So they have these nests, and there's a queen, and then there's all these other bees that do all the work for this beehive. And bumblebees are another social bee, but they're like nests that are more in the ground. that they create. And then there's solitary bees, which is what most bees across so-called North America are. Most indigenous bees, there's like thousands of solitary bee species in so-called North America in Turtle Island. And I was like, okay, so indigenous bees are solitary bees predominantly. That is mind-blowing. So that means everything I've ever learned about bees is these colonizer bees, basically, that came from Europe, Asia, Africa, and many other places. And so that was like an awakening moment. And then also came to learn that, like, when people were panicking that the bees were going to die off, they were panicking about honeybees. And that was back in like 2011 that people were like, the bees are going to die and we're not going to have any food. And there's all these graphics around like, these are the foods that you wouldn't have if we didn't have honeybees. And
I remember that. I was worried.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess I fell for it too.
And there, I guess, you know, in terms of this colonial food system we all rely on, there is validity to that. But what they did, these bee researchers, is propose, because, you know, there's not a lot of money going towards pollinator research, but, well, they examined what these beekeepers were doing with their honeybees. And they recognize, okay, you just bring your bees to pollinate one specific crop. And perhaps you could try bringing your honeybees to different plant species. So instead of just doing canola, bring them to canola and blueberries and perhaps something else. And the bee health improved. They also improved antibiotics for these honeybees. And basically now the honeybee populations have not only recovered, they surpassed what they were back in 2011. So I was like quite distraught. I'm like, so basically for decades, human beings were torturing these honeybees by being like, well, let's continue to like create antibiotics and create more antibiotics rather than just letting them pollinate different foods, because they're so disconnected from these bees that they don't even realize like they need a variety of foods. They were strictly treating them like a machine. So I felt really sad for the honeybees. But then, as much sympathy as I have for the honeybees, I learned that solitary bees, indigenous bees, they only forage 50 to 100 meters from their nest. And remember, these are solitary bees. They don't have a beehive. It's just a solitary bee is a female bee who makes a nest where she lays eggs. She plants, or she packs each egg with pollen so that when those eggs eventually hatch, that they're going to have their first food source of the pollen that they pack them with. And one day they'll emerge and they'll become pollinators. But it's just one female bee who makes those nests. The male bees don't do anything with the nests. So where these honeybees, all these male bees, you know, do all this work for the hive, the solitary bee is the female bee who does all the work for the nest. And the male bees are just kind of like hanging around like, we'll pollinate. And we're here when you need someone to mate with. Like, girl, I got you. And that's pretty much how that works. So I'm like, seems like they have something figured out.
Yeah.
So honeybees can pollinate for miles. They can go miles away from their nest. And I'm like, wow, that's like it couldn't be a more like clear comparison of like indigenous people and colonizers, right? Because like indigenous people, we know our boundaries, we know our limits, and we stay within them. For the solitary bee, it's 50 to 100 meters from their nest. For us as like Salish people, you know, the land and the waters give us our boundaries that we mostly stay in, that we recognize as our own. And when we go beyond those boundaries, we recognize we are a guest in someone else's territory, whereas honeybees are like the colonizer. They'll go miles and miles and miles away from their nest, and they don't care if they're like, oh, a whole swarm of bees come and pollinate this whole meadow. They don't care that they leave nothing behind for the indigenous bees to pollinate, right? They're not thinking about anyone but themselves and their own nest. So I ended up writing a story called Samsamaya. And that part that I just told you, I don't even have that story written down yet, but I do plan to write a story about that. But the story of Samsamaya is like how the bee came to be. And I wrote it in a way that was just like the origin stories that I've heard in my own culture, right? Like the origin of chia, which is the Steller's jay.
Oh, okay.
The blue jay here on the West Coast. We have an origin story of how that bird came to be. And we have different origin stories of different animal species. And so this was a quote unquote origin story that I created about the origin of the bee. And so different behaviors, different experiences that she has in the story is meant to be like a curriculum of what I learned in my pollinator stewardship certification course. And it's really sweet because like some people will hear it and they'll be like, is that true? And I'm like, well, is it a story that comes from my ancestors? No. But is it true? I believe so. Because Samsamaya, the indigenous pollinators, they will always care for the land. As long as there's flowers, she will always pollinate. And as long as there is access to land, indigenous women will want to take care of it, and I believe that. And so this creating access to the land is to be like, I don't have to teach you indigenous women anything, really. Like you already have that within you to love the land, to care for the land. I know you do because we're the same, because we come from the same people. We come from this land. And all we've ever needed is an opportunity to exist, to understand our role in the ecosystem, in addition to our role within our communities. My learning as a certified pollinator steward just gave me more space to be able to help communicate my own understanding of that for myself, for, I guess, my role in community, for my way of supporting other Indigenous women. And I say other Indigenous women, I should really say like my relatives, because they're extended family of mine, they're family of mine. And so to be a good relative to them, I got to share what I know and share my gifts, like a lot of people are drawn to me, and it makes me think of the Camas, right? Because people aren't just drawn to me, they're drawn to many Coast Salish people in the way that we share, I feel like the way that I share is reflective of how so many of my people share. And I think about the Camas, the reason why this plant is so important, not just to our people in terms of it being our food staple, but it's also important to the indigenous solitary bees and other pollinators, is because it's the most visited plant by pollinators within this region. And the camas flower is this beautiful purple lily. And if you look at the petals of a camas flower, like there's these little white specks within them, and it looks like stars. I swear it looks like stars. And if you look at it long enough, you can see galaxies just within a petal of a camas. And I think they're called anthers or whatever, the parts of it that hold up the pollen are just sticking straight out. There's flowers that like close and they cover up the pollen because the pollen, they're trying to protect their nectar, right? it's like there's some flowers like the honeysuckle, for example, like the way that flower grows, like you can pick it and then you have to suck out the nectar to get it, right? And some bees will actually go and they'll just cut it because they're like, it's too hard to squish, especially bumblebees, right? They can't squish inside that flower. So they'll just cut at the bottom to get to the nectar. But camas is wide open. So like every pollinator that comes by, they're like, ooh, look at that. Ooh, look at that pollen. Ooh, look at that pollen. Look at that nectar that I can get. It's so open. And we as Coast Salish peoples, as Satanish, Lekwungen, Tux, peoples, we deserve to exist in that openness in relationship to one another because it's so much of the beauty. You know, we don't have to try. We have a right to exist to not just protect ourselves, you know? It's like, just be a good relative, you know, value me, see me as sacred, and don't try to hurt me. And also trust that that's how I see you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tiffany. That's awesome. And I think a beautiful place to wrap the podcast. And so thanks so much for sharing with us. If anybody wants to know more about the work that Tiffany's doing, you can check out our show notes. We didn't even have a chance to talk about how Tiffany was helped make a documentary on the Cowichan sweater. So I think Cowichan sweater, Our Knitted Legacy is the name, and you can see it on CBC Gem as well, kind of documenting knitters and their community too. So yeah, we'll have links to all of that in the show notes. So thanks again, Tiffany.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks so much, Tiffany, for coming on the podcast and sharing. You are just amazing. So proud of all the work that you're doing in your nation and in proving to people that yes, fires did happen on Vancouver Island that were done by Indigenous people with intention. So really looking forward to seeing what you continue to do there. On the next podcast episode, we actually are featuring Dr. Alex Sahara, who's a colleague of mine who is an amazing ally. And I really wanted him to come on and chat just about how to be an ally to Indigenous people in Good Fire. I get a lot of questions about it from folks asking what they can do. I also see, honestly, a lot of overstepping and inappropriate action. And anyways, I just love the work Alex does. Excited to have him as a colleague. And yeah, really excited to have him on the podcast as a guest. He always makes me laugh and brings lots of positivity. So excited that you all get to meet him on the next episode. See you soon.
A huge thank you to Canada Wildfire for their support of this podcast. As well, we would like to thank the Fighting Gunditjmara for allowing us to share their fire song Ween as the official song of Good Fire Podcast.